Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our panel discussion on programming responses to power grabbers in times of crisis. My name is Christy Martins, and I work in DI's home office in the Center for Secure and Stable States. Our discussion today will be around programming responses to power grabbers, such as insurgent groups that are trying to exploit the COVID-19 pandemic for their own nefarious means. We will draw on lessons learned from past experience, and we will look at the current landscape of COVID-19 in 3 specific case studies as well as globally. As we hear our panelists' presentations, I invite you to think about where you are seeing power grabbing take place in response to COVID and who is trying to grab power. Please type your thoughts into the comment box as they come to you, and my colleague will curate them and summarize for us to kick off the Q&A following the presentations. Next slide, please, Gabby. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists. First up is Natalie Brunet, who will be presenting the Haiti case study. Natalie has 20 years of experience working as an entrepreneur and development specialist in challenging contexts. Next slide, please, Gabby. Next is Mussarat Kadim, who will be presenting the Pakistan case study. Mussarat is the Executive Director of Paiman Alumni Trust, a pioneer organization in preventing and countering violent extremism and inclusive peace education in Pakistan. Next slide, please. Then we have Sylvester Baeza presenting the Mozambique case study. Sylvester is an international development professional with 17 years of experience in the stabilization and governance sector. Next slide, Gabby. Wrapping things up for us will be Julia Drood, who will present the Washington perspective. Julia is a senior conflict advisor at USAID Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention in the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, and she is also a member of USAID's Peace and Security Sector Council. Next slide, please, Gabby. So as we start this discussion, I would invite everybody to start to consider how we're defining power. There are different levels of power, and we need to think about what it means to different people in different societies. For the purposes of this conversation, for the most part, we'll be defining power grabbing as a means of seizing an opportunity for political gain, influence, and/or wealth. A theme you'll hear throughout our panelists' presentations, as well as the concept of internal and external power grabbers and the different considerations we need to tackle when we're considering whether people are internal or external to the context in which we're operating. Next slide, please, Gabby. 2 cross-cutting themes for us to keep in mind throughout the discussion are conflict sensitivity and sexual exploitation and abuse. I think we're familiar with these concepts being peace builders, all of us listening in today. You'll hear these cross-cutting issues as recurring themes through our panelists' presentations as they present their case studies, and so just keep them in mind as we're thinking through the discussion after the panelists' presentations. So thank you in advance for joining us today, and we look forward to an engaging discussion. Over to you, Natalie. Natalie, are you able to take yourself off mute?
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'll be focusing on the Haiti context. Next slide, please. One of the least developed countries, Haiti's current fragility is a result of 3 decades of political instability and public sector neglect, weak institutions, huge wealth inequality, and extreme environmental degradation, making it prone to climate change effects on top of frequent natural disasters. The population is very young, and with limited access to education and other public services, organized crime is on the rise. Understandably, there's a huge dependency on diaspora remittances and other external actors whose actions are mostly uncoordinated. Next slide. In times of chaos, external groups under different umbrellas usually enter Haiti with the objective of fixing or helping to improve the situation. Many of them exploit the chaos on the ground to gain some form of power, social, political, religious, or economic, often to the detriment of the people they claim to be helping. For example, after the January 2010 earthquake, which had leveled the capital city to the ground, displaced over 1 million people and killed hundreds of thousands, Haiti was referred to as the Mecca of NGOs. The country was flooded with nonprofits and foreign investment groups that were competing for funds that were set aside for relief efforts and reconstruction projects. Donor agencies from the most powerful countries competed for political influence. In the end, the impact of the aid was widely disputed, and many allegations of corruption were associated with the interim Haiti Recovery Commission, the platform created to manage donor funds that was co-chaired by President Clinton and the Prime Minister of Haiti at the time, as well as with the institutions that profited the most from those contracts. Next slide, please. Local actors also position themselves for power grabbing in times of chaos. There are 3 types of traditional power grabbers in Haiti. The nefarious families from the elite that don't usually get their hands dirty but profit the most from the economic exchanges. They hold the most power out of the 3. Then there's bureaucrat facilitators, and then the gangs or foot soldiers. Those typically receive direct financial sponsorship by one or more of the families in Group 1. Next slide, please. I've illustrated a classic case scenario of how this dynamic functions here. Let's say, for example, a donor-funded program in the wash sector, and there's a certain member of Group 1 who's in the know, might put together a proposal for a project worth maybe $800,000, proposing its services for installation of temporary toilets in low-income neighborhoods. Having won the contract, the family hires the bulk of its team from the gang ruling the project area. This reinforces the power of the gang, increases its loyalty to the family, and at the same time guarantees that rival gang members won't attack or destroy the project. Mid-level bureaucrats, many of whom are taking bribes on the side, facilitate all of this by implementing a system of checks and balances that looks good to the outside world, but in fact, it masks what's really going on. A key part of this setup is to provide cover for the Group 1 member when they're not able to deliver either the quality or quantity set out by the terms of the project contract. In these instances, loyal gangs might also be enticed to increase the level of violence in the project region, making it impossible for delivery of the goods or monitoring and evaluation of the final results. It's particularly important for there to be no ongoing stain on the Group 1 family name, because they have to be able to come back over and over for more projects funded by the same set of international donors. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the lessons learned and best practices from this context. First of all, the external power grabbers are often filling pre-existing gaps. They're usually groups that had social capital or programs in the country before the disaster hit. And likewise, the internal power grabbers are usually members of groups that were either affluent or influential before disaster hit. The best practice is that reality is not always what it seems like from the outside, and what works in one place may not work somewhere else. It's important to understand the societal dynamics in order to better frame program responses. Next slide. Second of all, the system goes into hyperdrive when external funds enter the country as a result of political chaos, natural disaster, or public health outbreaks. In situations of shock that lead to the system collapse or breakdown, there's low or no rule of law, no checks and balances to ensure transparency and accountability. It's therefore imperative to improve due diligence processes. This means not always working with the same community groups that are monopolizing the assistance, spreading the wealth more widely between and within the communities, and performing rigorous due diligence for the selection of implementing partners and vendors during the procurement process, but also the selection of program beneficiaries, not including relatives in the beneficiary list, for example. Next slide. In this context, there's a foundation of built-in corruption. So the best practice is really to use in-country networks to map out reliable partners in the community and leverage on them to deliver the aid through the right channels so that it reaches the intended beneficiaries in a safe, appropriate manner. This means that it should be required to constantly refine the program's strategic approach in order to prevent aid from being diverted to groups that are not development-oriented. Next slide. Bottom line, when real service is being provided at the community level, the impact is tangible. There are many examples of this, and the best practice derived from this, it's best to deliver services at the community level and transfer ownership to the implementers of those services. Next slide. Although many allegations surfaced in recent years in Haiti when mainstream media exposed scandalous behavior of high-profile NGO officials who use their status and privileges to engage in sexual exploitation and abuse after the earthquake, in the context of programs implemented at the community level, it's not uncommon for community leaders to ask for sexual favors in exchange for adding people on a beneficiary list, for instance. In the end, SCA becomes prevalent whenever actors are empowered by the aid system, irrelevant of what role these power grabbers play in the system. Best practices are really to reinforce prevention efforts, which are key to understand what's not acceptable behavior. Second, trusted and safe reporting mechanisms through community feedback loops. And third, accountability for perpetrators to end a culture of impunity. Next slide. Since international organizations have to abide by do no harm and other principles and standards, where do we draw a line on when collaborating with certain groups presents more harm than benefits to the program, to the point that it may undermine its purpose? For example, there have been many instances in Haiti when program staff have had to give cutbacks to gangs in order to access communities at risk or in need. This requires serious thought. As a best practice, in cases when it's necessary to engage with adverse groups in order to deliver programs, it's important to develop mechanisms in order to mitigate the associated risks. Organizations need to establish clear thresholds as to when engaging with certain groups is an acceptable degree of corruption that can be overlooked because it's the price to pay for achieving greater objectives, versus when aid diversion and corruption actually undermine the legitimacy of the program and its core objectives. Next slide. In terms of COVID-19, the virus took the world by storm, and considering the deficiencies of public health system and limited health infrastructure in Haiti, another humanitarian crisis was expected. It was also expected that typical power grabbers would flood the stage and run the show. But circumstances were different in this instance. There was a limited presence of external power grabbers, because the pandemic was not a Haiti-specific problem, mobilizing leaders around the world around the need to improve the situation in their own countries. And because of travel restrictions, external actors were not able to mobilize easily or as quickly as usual. Virtual platforms were used to attempt at a distant response, but it limited the visibility and reach of these actors and their programs. Second of all, there were, for the most part, internal power grabbers didn't have access to sophisticated global networks of procurement and supply, didn't have outreach capacity, and were unable to offer medical supplies and resources that were needed. As a consequence, the government of Haiti was able to self-organize and quickly mobilize, forging direct access to suppliers of medical goods that were in high demand from China, using treasury funds and locally based experts for devising an efficient strategy for containment of the pandemic and population care in the first months. Next slide. Lesson learned from this recent pandemic is really the overwhelming presence of power grabbers might weaken the formal institutions of the country. I know this is a provocative thought, but it's worth thinking about. As a best practice, in order to find a fine line, it's important to find a route that has enough checks and balances, but provides some government legitimacy. For instance, municipal authorities are the most underutilized part of government infrastructure in Haiti and usually the least corrupt. Second, building capacity of civil society as a watchdog and for monitoring allocation and spending, for instance. That's it for my presentation.
Thanks so much, Natalie. We're going to go to Sylvester now for the Mozambique case study. Monserrat is having some internet issues, so we'll try to get her back on after Sylvester. Over to you, Sylvester.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Natalie. That was a very good presentation. Well, as Christina mentioned, my name is Sylvester Baessa, and I'm a senior program manager for DAI OTI program in northern Mozambique. This program is a response to a growing insecurity in this region of Mozambique, and that insecurity results from the activities that are taking place in that region by a local Islamic group linked to Islamic State. Over the last 3 years, the violence in these areas killed thousands of people. We have some 400,000 people that are now living in other areas, fleeing the conflicts. Thousands of villages and dozens of towns have been destroyed over that period. So there is a fear that the violence can spread all across Mozambique, north of Mozambique, but also other countries in the regions, particularly Tanzania, which is one of the cases. While those points that you have in the next slide do not necessarily are the causes for the conflict, it's fair enough to say that the fact that this province, Cabo Delgado, the fact that being very, very poor, despite billions of dollars that have been invested in extractive industry, natural gas, rubies, and so on, with less benefit from local communities, is again something that Islamic group is not maximized. This Islamic group also is using mostly anti-government narratives, emphasize grievances that really, in order to get access to community, to get sympathies, and also to recruit young people that are frustrated with the government. On the top, in general terms, the government response has been heavily handed and ineffective. On the top of that, we have the COVID-19. And the COVID-19 affected mostly, in the early days of the pandemic in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado again was the most affected province. And the government and the strict lockdown measures imposed by the government affected mostly the poor population. As you may understand, most of the poor populations in countries like Mozambique, they live from private informal activities. They need to go to the streets, and in the case of lockdown, that's affect a lot the income generation. And from that, we understand quickly that there is two major risks from that. That could be, while maximized by ISIS laws. One was that they could provide financial support to communities in order to mitigate economic impact of lockdown. The second, which is common in Mozambique, we have previous experience, is that the ISIS laws could even use disinformation or lockdown measures to expose more the government ability to respond to community needs and then exploiting the grievance. As a program, we understand that that could be a risk, and we decide to take two measures to counter that risk or to mitigate the impact of that. The first was try to address immediate economic grievance by mobilizing local communities to produce their own masks, and that end up with the productions of thousands of masks. So we buy the equipment, the materials, and so on, and we give that the possibility to produce the masks. We pay them for the masks, but all those masks have been distributed across the community, special for those most in need communities. We also combine different activities. For instance, the mass distributions, we use mostly young activists that went door to door, locating those families in need, distribute masks, but also to talk about the COVID-19 and the necessary measures that communities should take to address that. The second, on these possibilities of misinformation led by ISIS models, we decide to carry out a door-to-door civic awareness and education campaign to mitigate negative message and keep citizens safe. So we end up target some 100,000 families all across in Pemba, which is the capital of Cabo Delgado, but also in Palma and other districts that are highly affected by the COVID, but also under the range of ISIS MOS. We also do some TV and radio campaign regarding that. And in the top of that, we also use local materials to produce tip tops that community could have always access to water to clean their hands and so on, considering that the majority of population do not have even access to water. So it's try to combine different activities that could at least mitigate that ISIS MOS could take advantage of that situation. While those two activities are still happen, what is critical just in the end to conclude from my side is that there is two lessons that I take from this. One is that information is essentially, it's not a new lesson, but is essentially, I mean, to avoid that ISIS MOS, in the case of Mozambique, to take advantage of communities. Cabo Delgado in particular, as let's say 60% or 2/3 of population is without no educations and so on, without access to information. So it's important from our side to be there and be able to provide the necessary information. The second is act fast. If we have a situation like that, it's really important, and that is the flexibility that OTI program has in that context to allow us to act fast and be also ready, not always to win, but sometimes you need to fail. But in that case, from the outcomes that we can see now, it seems that there is a very few evidences of communities that really are not taking serious the government measures. We can see thousands of people even fleeing the conflict in the northern of Mozambique, using masks and so on, which means that people really understand that message. And that for us is important as lessons for next interventions. Thank you. I'll be ready for answer your questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sylvester. And Musarrat is back. Musarrat, if you could please unmute and turn your video on. Musarrat will speak to us about the Pakistan case study.
Thank you, Christy. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Pakistan, basically, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan is the world's fifth most populous country with a population exceeding 212 million. It has the world's largest Muslim population, and it's in terms of hazards, Pakistan is among the most disaster-prone countries in South Asia, having suffered an estimated $18 billion in damages and losses during the past decade and a half. The period 2009 and 2015 was particularly devastating for Pakistan, as the country experienced a number of natural disasters like earthquake, floods, drought, heat waves, and of course currently we are all facing and grappling with this endemic COVID-19. Now, in Pakistan, the ground realities it differs a little bit from the others, in the sense whenever Pakistan is hit by any sort of disaster, especially the natural disaster, people it unifies the people, it connects the people. So I call disaster a connector for the people of Pakistan, because the philanthropy and volunteerism is always at its peaks when Pakistan is being hit by any sort of disaster. And then it gives a lot of, there is a lot of funds, so a lot of resources are available to be, of course, like, given to the people in need. But at the same time, with more resources, of course, comes more corruption, and of course, unequal distribution and misuse of resources also becomes a part of this whole phenomena. In the context of, I would say, the COVID-19, what happened, like any other country, we have the internal power grabbers and the external power grabbers. I'm just going to concentrate on the internal power grabbers because everybody knows about who the external power grabbers are. So I'm just going to speak about the internal power grabbers in Pakistan. We have, of course, the political elites. Whenever there is the resources are available, they know how to exploit the situation to their interest. Then there are the traders, and there are some big wig in NGOs who also try to exploit the situation, because they are always they can always approach not only the donors but also the philanthropists, and like they are more resourceful as compared to the smaller organizations. Then at the same time, we have a very powerful group that has emerged since the flood of 2010, and these are the violent extremist groups. They were there, of course, during the earthquake also, but now specifically in the context of the COVID-19, they became too active. They somehow, due to the military operations, the violent extremist groups in Pakistan have been oppressed. And many limited their activities, but some of the extremist groups under the garb of new groups quickly responded to COVID-19 in two ways. One, the violent extremist groups looked at the pandemic through the lens of their ideology and misled the people. They interpret the virus as heavenly retribution on their enemies, which cannot harm any true Muslim. So this was very misleading for the common people, who all started gathering in the public places, especially in the mosque, and the situation was created where nobody could actually, ask them to leave the mosque because of the religion, because due to the, of course, the religion factor. The other group, they came prepared with loads of ration, PPEs and cash, along with their propaganda material to distribute to the vulnerable, thus, of course, enhancing their circle of support. Because in any case, the violent extremist group, they have readily available resources to distribute immediately after any disaster, and they were the first one to respond to the needs of the comparatively large number of people. They have roots in the communities, and they are well versed of the local condition, needs, and requirements. So they also play on the people's needs and the religious sentiments, their goals, their tactics, their capabilities, and their level of engagements are more sophisticated as compared to government. Now, in this situation, what was our response to, of course, the COVID-19 in particular? So my organization, PAMAD's programming response to political and ideological power grabber was multifaceted. The first thing that we did, that we strengthen and enhance the capacity and capability of our women peace groups, which is called Tolana. Tolana is a Pashto word which means together. So these peace groups, the women peace groups in particularly, we train them in stitching not only the masks but also preparing hand sanitizers as per the guidance of WHO. And they also, we gave them, like, we prepared the messages, the pamphlets, so as to respond in two ways. One, to the violent extremist propagandas, and also to the political influential who are already there to take advantage of the situation. So we immediately responded to extremist misinformation in the form of religious-based narratives. We developed the alternate narratives to their narratives, again in the context of the Quran and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We also mitigated the threats of hate speech, the misinformation, the extremist messaging, and of course the fake news and rumor management through distributing the pamphlets not only publicly but of course through the radio messaging, and we also used door to door, and I would say the pamphlets and the posters in the public. We displayed posters in the public places. But one other thing that we really did was we used our own rooftops for not only creating awareness amongst the women, but also keeping the social distancing from the rooftops. And that was very innovative, and that really helped women understanding how they can protect themselves and their loved ones from during the COVID-19 situation. Then we also developed a gender responsive GBV community task force to the prevalence of the gender based violence during pandemic. We also formed mobile health unit to distribute medicine, carry out safe deliveries, and of course take care of neonatal and postnatal, and of course to take care of the newborn babies and of course their mothers. So this was our response to the COVID-19. In the context of Pakistan, the information materials and the programs on responding to violent extremist groups was quite risky, but we tried to take preventive measure and disseminate the information through electronic media, particularly to the radio, which has a huge listener, and that's why the information reached far to the far-flung areas as well. The other thing that was really helpful was actually when the women responded to the gender-based violence one, and of course when they went out in the mobile health unit to provide health services to the women in need, that really created a sort of it was taken as an example by the government itself, and the government asked us for expanding our program not only in one district but to the other districts as well. We closely work with the district disaster management authority in one of the districts, where we have been distributing the PPEs, food and rations, where we distributed food rations and PPEs to 14,000 community members. And I would say here, I would like to mention the name of ICANN, who actually initially funded us to support the district Charsada through the distribution of these 4,000 PPEs and of course rations and food. That was really very helpful for us. The recommendation, I would say, I would recommend that government like Pakistan should track and record the anti-COVID-19 measures taken by violent extremist groups and share with international humanitarian communities so they can develop strategies and policies accordingly in case of any future, of course, disaster. States also should understand that the world's fight against COVID-19 may be lost in the remote areas where there are gapping holes in healthcare services that are easily and quickly filled by violent extremist groups. The other very important, I think, lesson learned for us is that state and donors should encourage public-private partnership for effective response, recovery, and reconstruction to coordinate disaster preparedness. We also need to work together, communicate with one another, and share resources to save lives and reduce losses. Payman in 2010 and now in 2020, we entered into such partnership with private groups and communities and tailor our program to the needs of the communities. In the end, I would just say state and humanitarian donors should devote resources to other phases of the disaster cycle as well, like preparedness, recovery, and rehabilitation. And we should never forget to include women in decision making related to recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. Because in the case of the COVID-19, Payman's Women's Peacebuilders group were the first respondents to the COVID situation in one of the districts where the cases are on the reduction and people are more aware to respond to the COVID situation now. And I hope the recommendations will be taken seriously by those by the key stakeholders in particular. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Masrat. What a great recommendation to end on. Julia, over to you next, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Drude. I'm a senior conflict advisor with USAID's Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention in the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. And I'm honored to be a part of this panel today alongside these impressive panelists. I'd like to briefly provide for this panel the perspective of how USAID and our peacebuilding community of practice have applied a conflict lens for the development response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated impacts, both those expected and those unexpected, including the amplification of fragility and conflict dynamics, such as the increased risks for power grabbing. Next slide, please. At USAID in the Bureau for Conflict Prevention Stabilization, CPS, our role is to partner with USAID missions and provide technical leadership for the agency on peace building, conflict, and violence prevention. Since earlier this year, like many of you, we've been supporting the agency's response to the COVID-19 crisis and, importantly, to those secondary impacts through our sector expertise and programming. While we've seen a range of actors attempting to exploit the global health crisis for their own nefarious ends, we do recognize that these are not all new actors on the stage. The groups and individuals seeking to take advantage of the disorder to gain ground and gain influence are the ones that we've known all along. Yet their attempts at power consolidation have only become more brazen, if not also unchecked. We've seen this pandemic upend normalcy, even in the most stable states, while also exposing the core realities of fragility that persist in virtually every country where we work. Thus, more than ever, we've needed and will continue to need a conflict-sensitive approach to deal with those core issues of fragility exploited by malign power grabbers. So today I'm going to speak to three key contributions of our USAID peacebuilding community's response to the exacerbation of fragile conditions imposed by the pandemic that have given space for power grabbers. Next slide, please. We in our Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, CVP, we maintain that in all phases of conflict and crisis, it's critical to keep a focus on assessing and addressing underlying conditions of fragility and conflict dynamics. We must continue to see more than just the tip of the iceberg. As I noted earlier, the onset of COVID-19 has not introduced the malign actors attempting to manipulate the crisis, but has rather created new openings for their power consolidation, their growth, and their influence in the midst of distracted governments, stretched resources, and lack of access and oversight. So in order to address these power grabbers, such as the examples that you've just heard from the other panelists, we must seek to also address underlying conditions that make states vulnerable to conflict and violence before and throughout crises. Our center, CBP, therefore developed guidance for USAID missions and programs on addressing fragile and conflict-affected conditions exacerbated by COVID-19 under the rubric of conflict sensitivity. In this guidance, we recognize that times of crisis exacerbate existing challenges, as all of you are very well aware, such as through heightened constraints on movement and access to beneficiaries, the flooding of media with disinformation, the heavy-handed government restrictions on public discourse, the proliferation of domestic violence during lockdown, and of course, violent extremists exploiting unchecked spaces. Our conflict-sensitive guidance recommends that responses to the rapidly evolving crisis and the associated impacts should aim to address the conditions that create unique opportunities for exploitation of vulnerable situations by power grabbers, while also capitalizing on opportunities for enhancing social cohesion and peace building. This guidance provides recommendations for how to stay atop of changes in the conflict dynamics due to the pandemic, while building in measures into our programming and oversight for the additional and necessary flexibility, adaptation, and coordination. We also emphasize in the guidance that we should ensure that our response to COVID-19 does not benefit some groups over others, inadvertently reinforcing power disparities within countries or regions. We also advise ensuring that our assistance is not reinforcing authoritarian measures being implemented by governments, including human rights violations, which may include the denial of healthcare supplies and services or other life-saving aid. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, USAID worked with partners to adapt conflict management programming in order to respond to new challenges posed by the pandemic. This included developing and implementing COVID-19 response plans with measures for mitigating risks to social cohesion and trust, addressing information gaps on pandemic responses, responding to immediate service provision needs, as well as monitoring impacts on the incidence of gender-based violence. Next slide, please. The second contribution from USAID's peacebuilding community for responding to the pandemic has been guidance on anticipating and preparing for the secondary impacts of COVID-19 on stability, such as anticipating power grabbing by nefarious actors. The guidance developed by our center focuses on identifying and describing the risks that the pandemic has posed or may pose to the political or social stability of countries. I'll highlight just a few of the risks that we recommend our programming should assess. The first is the potential damage to crisis management and conflict resolution mechanisms. We should consider what the pandemic has revealed about the performance of health systems and other service delivery. Specifically, does the host nation response reveal patterns of exclusion, corruption, or lack of accountability that point to the potential for areas of intervention? Another key risk to anticipate are related to risks to social order. We should assess how the situation has affected the ability or the perception of the ability for the government to provide basic services and support the population. For instance, are there indications of increased risks of instability due to changed citizen government dynamics? Are violent extremists or organized criminal networks capitalizing on the crisis, as we heard from earlier panelists has happened? Another key area to consider is the potential for political exploitation of the crisis. It's imperative that we consider to what extent host country governments' use of emergency decrees, for instance, are a cause for concern. Are there enhanced or heavy-handed roles for the military in light of weak government capacity or willingness to respond holistically to the crisis? Additionally, we had anticipated and have seen new limitations on freedom of speech or assembly introduced as part of a government response that may also be used to clamp down on dissent or opposition. One example of USAID-supported programming I'd like to highlight here is in West Africa. Our mission colleagues and partners have been able to adapt existing governance, conflict mitigation, and CVE programming to respond to the pandemic by addressing democratic backsliding in target countries in the region. This focus has been through a combination of approaches that prevent or mitigate conflict related to government responses to COVID-19, as well as to help address existing security vulnerabilities, such as the expansion of VEOs that will likely be aggravated due to COVID-19 related limitations and restrictions. Next slide. Lastly, the third contribution I'll highlight from USAID is from our Peace and Security Sector Council. Our Technical Sector Council developed guidance for our missions in the COVID-19 response for addressing risks and vulnerabilities to VEO influence and expansion. We know that VEOs, and have just heard from our other panelists as well, that they're capitalizing on the pandemic by increasing attacks where government security is distracted, or blaming governments for the effects of COVID-19 and spreading disinformation. As well as positioning themselves as service providers in some cases, responding to COVID-19 to gain popular support. Our Peace and Security Sector Council developed guidance for USAID on the impacts of COVID-19 on our CVE efforts, such as constrained access to key target populations, and the introduction of new or enhanced violent extremist aims and methods, that all of these may require adaptations to programming or monitoring and evaluation approaches. Such adaptations may include potentially greater needs for social media monitoring and countering disinformation. We will also need to monitor potential shifts in citizen-state relationships that may make populations more vulnerable to violent extremist messaging. And additionally, it'll be more imperative than ever to focus on increasing women's participation in peace and security sectors in COVID-affected areas, especially in those communities most vulnerable to violent extremists. Thank you very much again for having me today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's very helpful to end the presentations with a wrap-up of what's being considered across the table in Washington. Our first question for the group, and Monserrat, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to be the first panelist to respond. The question is, noting the presenters all touched on the fact that VEOs use crisis to their advantage and use misinformation to advance their cause, what should implementers and donors be thinking about in advance to offset these negative narratives from the onset, since we do not know when and where the next emergency will hit? Should new humanitarian response frameworks be developed to include activities that counter VE narratives? So Monserrat, over to you first, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. I think the best way for the human, like I said, we need to develop the alternate narratives in advance. Usually their narratives is based in the context of the specific text of the religion. We need to take out the text within the context and develop alternate narratives there to the religious narrative. Like in the case of pandemic, they came up with a lot of stories which were all false based. We had to actually, we conducted a lot of research and found out the practices during the life of the Prophet, where he made it very clear, whenever there is a pandemic, whenever there is a situation like a pandemic, please don't go out of your houses for prayers. Or you don't, the villagers where the pandemic is, the villagers should not leave their village. So this is so clear from the practices of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's why I said we really need to have the experts who can not only speak of the ideological aspect, like the religion aspect of it, which are usually misused by violent extremist groups, but also the culture-specific narrative is also important. And this is what we did in the case of Pakistan also. So I think we need to focus on two aspects. One is the culture, the other is ideological or faith-based narrative to which can be exploited by the extremist, not only by the violent extremist groups, but also by the lords, like by the feudal lords and by the people who call themselves the champions of their culture and tradition. So I think we really need to have experts within the humanitarian networks and the humanitarian organizations to develop alternate narratives, both in cultural specific and religious specific narratives.
Thanks, Monserrat. Sylvester, maybe you could build on her response with your experience in Cabo Delgado.
Thanks. I think Monserrat said a lot of what I was supposed to say. However, I would say that it's while we are clear that we need to counter that narrative, you end up in a very difficult situation, because counter that narrative sometimes it goes is challenged, because the type of grievance that they use to maximize the interventions are actually something that it's really hard for you to counter that. I mean, you in countries where corruption is very high, in countries where service delivery is very poor, and this is normally what they exploit. It's really hard to counter that narrative. So you may have the religious perspective, which is, as Monserrat was mentioned, that you can always go around and try to counter that. But when it's coming to economical type of grievances, it's really hard, to counter that when people are feel on reality that. The second, you have situations such corruptions on, let's say, humanitarian distributions, where you have situations of like woman right violations and abuse, and then you have to build around that. So it's a really complex. Seems simple in terms of what we have to do, but do that is require a lot of more knowledge. In projects like, let's say, OTI projects, which are very short in terms of period of implementation, you clearly have to invest more and try to build that trust with the government and so on, but you don't have much time. So while you invest on try to understand the narratives, try to understand how they communicate that, what are the channels that they use, where they communicate that, who are the target groups for that message. You also need to understand that you are not in a very good positions to counter those narratives, special because most of those results of ineffectiveness of the local government or the central government in those particular cases. So it's challenging. It's challenging.
Thanks, Sylvester. Julia, I know you've been thinking about this, across the globe, and providing guidance. I wonder if you wanted to wrap up the discussion on this particular question, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the other panelists hit on some really key points. I'll just add a couple of things. I think that what's important is something I alluded to is that we should be thinking about before we have a crisis, mapping out the dynamics that are at play, that are related to conflict, that are related to those underlying conditions that may make the situation or the context fragile, so that they may be more vulnerable to a power grabber or nefarious actor taking advantage of the system, of the society. So I think there's a lot that we can do pre-crisis, like the questioner asked, we don't know where the next crisis may hit. But there's a lot that we can do to prepare the way to address those underlying vulnerabilities and dynamics, including through messaging and anticipating messaging to really focus on promoting a stronger system, a stronger society, so that they would be less vulnerable to power grabbers once the crisis situation hits. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Julia. And thanks to our audience participants for adding your questions into the chat. Please keep that coming. Another colleague is curating the responses or the questions that come in and feeding them to me. Our next question is specifically for Natalie, the others in the group, particularly Massarat, given your experience and current focus, might be interested in chiming in on. But to Natalie, we've been talking about sexual exploitation and abuse, and it was named as a cross-cutting theme in the introduction. And I wonder if you could speak to it more specifically in the Haitian context, particularly post-earthquake, when there were some pretty global headlines of allegations of abuse. Over to you, Natalie.
And NGOs working in Haiti that constituted as international scandals of SEA. Some of these scandals have helped promote the impetus to improve institutional SEA awareness training and tools in recent years on a massive scale. But an important thing to consider is how do we remain accountable for people who don't work for us? Abusers are also community stabilizers we rely on to facilitate selection of beneficiaries, transfer information and goods in the communities, for example. And organizations have been focusing on this issue from a purely organizational good behavior perspective. These other power grabbers are not a reputational risk for the donors since they're part of the indirect aid delivery chain. However, they're empowered by the aid system. There's a lot of focus on traditional SEA scenario, but these other scenarios didn't start today. This has been going on in Haiti for over a decade, but it's only becoming a hot topic now. I think organizations are only starting to wake up to this now because it's a hard thing to do. A framework for addressing this type of sexual exploitation and abuse needs to be developed. And it's about creating tools and mechanisms to engage these actors, because sexual exploitation and abuse framework is still very much centered around abusers that work for us and not the middlemen from the community. It's an informal type of engagement because these people don't wear our logos. That's where I want to leave it at, and I think that's a big subject that needs to be addressed, and where there's a lot to draw from through the Haiti context.
Thanks, Natalie. Masarat, I'd like to invite you to speak to this topic in particular in the Pakistan context, please.
It was the domestic violence that literally, like, was on the rise. The gender-based violence we saw and we witnessed it during 2010 flood, where women were exploited in the name of, by some of the power grabbers. We responded to it by entering into a into a partnership with the local administration, and we developed a focal, I would say, a forum which is called the Gender GBV Forum. We included women elected representative, women peace builders, and some lady health workers. Even this time also during the pandemic, and we made sure that we create awareness regarding the gender-based violence in the community, so that it is taken care of before even it takes it takes its roots, or its strength, it becomes as pandemic. It becomes widespread in the communities. So we created a lot of awareness regarding gender-based violence issues in our area of influence, or in our area of work. This is how we responded during the flood time, during 2010 also, and during the IT peace crisis in Pakistan in 2009. Otherwise, I think when it comes to any disaster situation, the SGBV and the gender-based violence is always on the rise in countries where the humanitarian assistance is forthcoming, and people actually look towards people are exploited, and so it's actually sex is being women are the victims of the situation. So that's what I would just say. The humanitarian organizations working particularly in this context must respond to the situation on the ground, which usually is being ignored, with the exception of few organizations. The rest ignore the gender-based violence aspect, and they only pay lip service to it. So I would suggest that there should be some sort of a monitoring mechanism in place during the distribution of during this any disaster situation, the humanitarian assistance. There should be some sort of MND monitoring mechanism should be in place to, of course, monitor the distribution of humanitarian assistance in the communities where SGBV could be avoided. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Masarat. A very practical recommendation, and I think we can all agree that as peace builders, we definitely have some work to do on that issue. But thank you to you, Masarat, and to Natalie for what you're doing in Pakistan and Haiti, respectively. I'm going to turn us to the next question and invite Julia to answer first before I turn to Sylvester. The question is, in instances of VEOs operating as competitive service providers, what methods are available to international organizations or government actors to provide services without furthering outsider influence or ulterior motives narratives?
Great, thank you for the question. I think one of the really critical things to know first is who are the trusted service providers, trusted leaders within the community that it might be possible to work through. This might be going through government actors or other service providers, but first, it's critical to know what those trust dynamics are, those power dynamics within a community, so that when we as outsiders seek to come in and support the community in service delivery or in crisis response, we are working through trusted operators within the community, and that we are going as local as possible, so as not to be seen as providing outside interference, or so that our motives are questioned. But it's really critical to try to identify and work through local trusted groups and individuals. And you can just certainly map that out in advance as well. It's not something that necessarily has to be done just on the onset of the crisis, but I think is probably a good practice generally in order to be as effective as possible. In addition to that, I think what's really important and critical to think about is not just where are those trusted service providers and trusted stakeholders within society, leaders, et cetera, but how do we try to enhance social cohesion and trust throughout the work that we do in its delivery? And that might be, how do we build in opportunities for dialogue and trust building in healthcare provision or other service delivery, so that it is not just about getting the product out or the service out, but it's about really enhancing the strength of the system in a society as an ultimate goal as well. That ultimately doing that through service provision will also ensure that there's less space for outsiders to come in and take advantage of the situation. And the last thing that I'll note here is it's also really important as we are looking to provide services to a community in a crisis response mode or otherwise, and that we consider what is the strategic messaging around those services and how they're being delivered. Are we ensuring that we as donors or the partners or with those that we're working with locally, what's the message that we're delivering around the service that's being provided, the why and the how and the who, and ensuring that that there is a clear empowerment for those trusted actors that is part of the process of service delivery as well. Again, to reinforce trust dynamics, to strengthen the social cohesion, ultimately as an output of the process as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Julia. Right on the mark. Sylvester, would you mind following up on Julia, please?
Mozambique, when that question came up, the first thing was one area that ISIS Moors is actually capitalized in Mozambique is finance, is access to finance for those small sellers, and that most of them do not have the requirements for access to resources on private banking or government economy type of initiative, funds, and so on. So someone, and that's the big. So we have been seeing from the reports and some of testimonies, information that we got from our field advisor, and we have a great discussion days ago. Who are the profile of people that normally are recruited by ISIS in Mozambique and Cabo Delgado, most of them are small sellers, small businessmen. They need money to invest. They don't have money. The system is not in favor of those groups of people. And that is where ISIS must come in. So they provide small grants for those young businessmen. They provide small grants for men, for family to start business and so on. And that's this area where actually, if you go from the government point of view, the process is very corrupt. If you go from the bank's point of view, the private sector, most of those people do not fit on the criteria. So that's again a big challenge. Is in addition, now you can't have special now. I mean, there is that attempt of taking those institutions, those systems that would make more accessible for resources for people at those levels. But trust, as Julia mentioned, is a key issue. So moving forward, I mean, from our point of view, it's a little bit challenge again to come up with the very concrete things that can be done and so on. But it's again the way how if we have in the context of Mozambique, institutions are really credible to provide that in such way that we can limit the impact of ISIS wars. We have in different places where they went through, they went to the banks, they took the money and they distribute the money for population. But at the same time, they have, let's say, money to give to local businessmen that went to Tanzania, to Nampula, other places to buy goods and to do their own business. Seems that those people are still available. If we can't block that money to come, we need to create alternatives. And I think this is, again, the big challenge that we have in PCV programs. While we are addressing, we are countering some of ISIS initiatives, let's say, in the case of Mozambique, we do not create, let's say, alternatives pathway for those specific groups. Of course, in the context of OTI projects, which are very smaller, you can't do much, but it's always, I think, long term, using that experience to build around those experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvester, and thank you again, Julia. I really like the concepts you all were raising, particularly around trust and social cohesion and working through local actors to build empowerment. Next question I'll invite Monserrat to respond to first, and then I'll turn to Natalie. The question is, Monserrat rightly noted needing key stakeholders to listen to the lived realities of those most impacted. This is something we all know, but that we, as an international community, often still fall short of. How can we make this a reality? Are there any considerations for do no harm or conflict sensitivity? Over to you, Monserrat.
Repeat the first part of the question.
Absolutely. Monserrat rightly noted that needing key stakeholders to listen to the lived realities of those most impacted. This is something we all know, but that we as an international community often still fall short of. How can we make this a reality? Are there considerations for do no harm or conflict sensitivity?
Yes, like the earlier panelists, they said, Julia and Sylvester, that you should have trusted partners. I'm still wondering about, like, who actually, are these trusted partners in the communities? Because the organizations, the local organizations who are working on the ground, they already have build their trust in the communities, and that's why they can be your eyes and ears. They have the knowledge of the local needs. They know what the requirements at the local level are, and they can be very helpful in conveying that that sort of situation to the humanitarian donors, or to any donors who is interested in responding to the situation. So I think you really need to have a network of organizations who are working on ground, who have been trusted partners, who have been trusted partners to the community, because these people have been there for decades, and they have developed that trust over a period of time. They are well received by the communities, so they already know the need of the communities, and this is where the knowledge lies. And that's what you can actually make use of, those organizations who are there. Because in such a situation, they'll be the best to, of course, the do no harm, adopt the do no harm strategy, and that will be very helpful for the donors to intervene or make conflict sensitive interventions in those areas. The second thing I really want to actually highlight here, and which I actually wanted to say earlier as well, was that in any emergency situation where the we groups are more, I would say, responsive, and they are more quick in responding to the situation as compared to the donors, to the state, or to any other agency or entity. We need to have actually maybe a regional humanitarian fund available instantly to any country which is hit by any disaster or any emergency. So a regional sort of humanitarian assistance and support should be, or resources should be pooled in the form of not only the funds, but also in the form of expertise, so that whenever there is an emergency in the region, like I would say South Asia, it should be available readily to the countries who are hard hit or who are affected by any sort of emergency. That's one thing. The other thing is, who decides about the trusted partners? I have this question in mind, that when the donor says the trusted partners, I really am curious, who decides amongst the donors about the local trusted partners, because I think everyone who is working as an NGO or as a grassroots organization in the communities, they are trusted by those people. So that's my question. I think to all the panelists, who decides the trustworthiness of an organization or a local partner? Um, hope I hope I have responded to your question, Christy.
You have, Masra. Thanks very much. And I've written your question down, and we'll go back to it in a minute. But I'd like to turn to Natalie quickly, because when I read this question in the chat, I noted from working with Natalie in post-earthquake Haiti that everybody we interacted with was impacted. And so, Natalie, again, the question is, how do we ensure that key stakeholders listen to the lived realities of those most impacted by the disaster or the crisis? And what considerations should we take into account for do no harm or conflict sensitivity?
Yes, I like how Montserrat ended her intervention by throwing the question back at us: who decides about the trusted partners? Because in my presentation earlier, when I talked about the internal power grabbing structure in Haiti, the traditional power grabbing structure, I emphasized the point that those power grabbers are, actors that have been on the ground and that are very experienced in positioning themselves so that they are able to have access to the funds and the opportunities extended by donors over and over and over, especially the higher level actors in the societal structure. So it can be complicated for an external actor in the development sector to come in and be able to really identify the good, well-intended actors, potential service providers. hence the importance of, due diligence and background checks and mapping exercises. And as Montserrat said, it's really the integration of in the conversations, the integration of just making sure it's as diverse as possible, the circle of communication and integration, and it's not just reliant on who knows who within the internal programming sphere. In the context of Haiti post-earthquake, this was a very particular instance, because when we talk about COVID, it is affecting everyone, but you can still shelter yourself from it. But in the context of an earthquake where about 300,000 people were presumably died, and 1 million people in a city that houses 3 million, like 1/3 of the city was displaced, everybody was affected by it. And so the lived realities were being shared every day. And in the context of the OTI project that Christy and I worked on at the time, I think it was not so difficult to really listen and understand to the realities of those that were the most impacted. It did not suffice, however, to deter. It did not suffice it does not suffice our program and those implementing the program anyways for deterring power grabbers at all levels of society, because there was just too many. I mean, the whole world was focused on this, and there was the influx of funds. It was so dramatic that whenever there is such an influx of funds, it's really difficult to filter through who are the well-intended and not so well-intended people. So it's a complex, it's a well-founded question and concern, but it's a complex thing to address. I second a lot of the suggestions made by Montserrat. It's really setting roots in the networks of organizations that are already working on the ground. I like the idea of setting a regional humanitarian fund that facilitates, the support of these small grassroots well-intended groups. It's not always easy to determine who the trusted partners are, but I think this is the kind of stuff that is determined at the community level, not always at the external actors management level. I don't know if this addresses the question how you anticipated I would, Christy.
It does, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. And from both you and Montserrat, I'll turn to Julia next, but some of the concepts that I heard come out were similar to things we've been discussing about trust at the community level and mapping of actors. But I also like, Natalie, how you commented on diversity of partners and, of course, due diligence checks that we're used to. One thing I also note for myself as a weakness being an external actor is language barriers. And I keep myself in check that, just because an organization speaks English doesn't make them more capable than another organization. And I think that's something for us to keep in mind as external actors too. Julie, I want to turn to you, please.
Great, thanks. And I will wade into the question of how do you know who are the trusted partners, and how do you assess that? I think that's a really good question, and I agree with what Montserrat and Natalie have offered for sure. I think that from our perspective, I think it's really important to recognize that, I think it was noted in the chat by some of the participants, that just because a group is there on the ground and is trusted by part of the community and is serving part of the community, we can't assume that that means that they enjoy the same levels of trust from other parts of the community and that they're equally serving all constituents and identity groups within a particular community. And so I think what's important for us to do, and what we try to do at USAID, is with a conflict-sensitive approach, ideally, understanding those different perspectives, and Natalie hit on that as well, those different perspectives of those different groups in the community. Who do they see as trusted, as reliable? Who is meeting their needs? Who do they go to when they have an issue or a challenge they need addressed? And really mapping out not just the stakeholders, but also the perceptions of those stakeholders and those groups is critical up front. And as Natalie also said, to go as local as possible. You're not going to get that at our level in Washington, but going as local as possible, and recognizing that it may not be one group or one partner or one intervention that's going to be required, because again, that particular group may not be the one that is able to enjoy trust across the community. So really mapping out, again, who is trusted, but also who may be excluded from some of those systems and who may need additional support or lines of intervention or trust building in order to ensure that they are also being met through the service provision, through the aid that's being offered. And I think at a minimum, ensuring that we're not furthering any divides within a community or furthering perceptions of marginalization within a community. Doing no harm in that regard is really critical. So and also building in as well opportunities to kind of assess and reassess those interventions and whether or not we are continuing to do no harm and also maximizing opportunities for peace and building social cohesion through these interventions. Are we creating more distrust through the selection of local partners? Are we ensuring that all different identity groups are well included and represented in the intervention as well? So I think it's also that process of constantly revisiting the work and getting additional perspectives on how it's being delivered and it's the performance of the work as well. And in order to, again, do no harm at a basic, but ideally to have positive impacts on social cohesion and peace within a society as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Julia. I think given the time, we're probably at our last question. And I'll turn to Natalie to respond first and then to Sylvester. The question is, are there lessons we can learn from the case studies we've heard today around power grabbing we've seen taking place in the US, particularly around the COVID-19 crisis? What might some of these lessons be?
Hello. Lessons we can learn from the US in terms of, or is it lessons we can learn from the cases exemplified in the panel today that could be applied to the US? Can you clarify, Christy?
Sure, exactly. It's the latter. So what lessons have we learned from case studies today that the US can learn?
Okay. Thinking about the COVID-19 situation in the US and all of the stress right now around access to the vaccine. I think across the board to exert power because they have access to privileged information and can withhold it. And the importance of establishing a lot of miscommunication and appropriation of information and misappropriation of information from what I'm I'm observing from the outside of the U.S. right now, but as a person looking at this from afar, this is what is being this is what it's seeming like, a lot of misappropriation of information and for exploitation of the pandemic. And I think that access to the information are withholding or manipulating it for their nefarious means. Establishing clear communities at the level, at the community level, is people to understand their we're not talking about text because it's not a country dependent on aid, but their entitlement to healthcare and to medical infrastructure and innovative, health solutions that are being designed for those communities. So I think the reason it's so challenging, the management of the COVID in the US right now, it's really because of information appropriation and misappropriation. And that is one clear way or sure way of just making the situation more complicated than it needs to be. And there's always room for exploitation and misconduct when there's manipulation of information. So that is one thing I think that needs to be taken into consideration. What other lessons learned I could apply in that context? I would say, when real service is being provided at the community level, impact is tangible. That was one of the lessons I highlighted from my presentation, and I think there are success stories in the US that in the COVID management, when we look at from state to state, how it's being managed from city to city, local government stepping up, and where there has been the most, where the epidemic has been the best, managed or contained, it's where there has been a more decentralized approach and local government leadership rising to the surface. So it's really about empowering communities and empowering the local actors to be able to take decisions that are best suited for their constituents, local government officials. So we also see in the Haiti context, for example, in a lot of the communities where the programs are being implemented, the ones where we see tangible impact, it's usually the ones where the aid or the program is designed to make sure there is a real and genuine inclusion of the local government actors. So I think that's interesting to see this unfolding in the US on a different scale, but similarly. What else could we say? There's always a frenzy for money, and the importance of doing due diligence in terms of, even with the distribution of the vaccines that are being approved. It's going to be interesting to see who are the privileged or the preferred community groups for receiving those vaccines. This morning, I was reading a headline about how it is very likely that it is the more wealthy will have access to the vaccine before the general population does. So there again, it's a type of system that facilitates monopolizing resources instead of facilitating a widespread within the communities, between and within the communities. And those are challenges to addressing public health outbreaks or whatever disasters in countries even as stable as the United States. So I think I've touched on a few things. I'm letting Montserrat pick up as well where she sees there could be applicable lessons from our developing world context in the context and to be applied in the context of the US with the COVID.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Some very, helpful recommendations that we need to take into account. I'd love to turn to Montserrat and Sylvester as well as to Julia. I think we could have a separate panel just on this conversation alone, but we are at time. So I'd like to thank our panelists and audience members for an excellent discussion. Thanks to the audience members who wrote questions into the chat, much appreciated. I invite everyone to visit DAI's virtual booth through the PeaceCon website. We have several written materials there, including a white paper by the same title as today's panel, Programming Responses to Power Grabbers in Times of Crisis, with some additional case studies on Burma, Tunisia, and Somalia. So again, many thanks to our panelists and thanks to all of those who tuned in. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.